April 12th, 1939, Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough, Hampshire. A low mist hugged the hangars, turning the air metallic with the scent of oil and ozone. Inside a draughty shed behind the test bays, a Merlin III engine coughed itself awake on a dynamometer stand. The great V1212 pistons, the size of coffee mugs, settled into a rhythmic growl that rattled loose screws in the corrugated walls. A few engineers stood close to the gauges, faces lit by the blue flicker of instrument dials. What they were doing was not on the schedule, nor entirely permitted. The Air Ministry had not authorized the fuel in the tank. It was American, smuggled into British test circles by way of Shell and Anglo-Iranian petroleum, an experimental batch of 100-octane aviation gasoline. It was labelled for evaluation use only. In truth, it was contraband science. For 3 years, Rolls-Royce engineers had been shackled by the limits of 87 octane, the official grade for fighter command. That fuel dictated every performance table, every climb curve, every sentence of the Spitfire's flight manual, and those limits were about to be rewritten. Stanley Hooker stood by the throttle console, a mathematician turned engineer with chalk smudges still on his cuffs. To Hooker, superchargers were puzzles in airflow, not mechanical trinkets. He had recalculated impeller clearances and redesigned inlet volutes until the Merlin breathed better than any piston engine of its kind. But he knew its lungs were stronger than its diet allowed. "She'll never show us her soul on 87, he had muttered once, earning a knowing smile from Sir Henry Tizard, the quiet godfather of British aeronautical research. Today, Hooker had an accomplice. Harry Ricardo, the combustion theorist whose wartime work on detonation had rewritten the physics of engines, stood beside him in a brown tweed suit that smelled faintly of petrol. He was the country's oracle on octane, its priest of flame. On a clipboard he had drawn a chart of detonation thresholds, the knock limit that separated steady power from catastrophic destruction. 100 octane, he explained to the skeptical Air Ministry inspectors weeks before, could push that threshold almost 40% higher than standard fuel. Theoretically, the Merlin could run at plus 12 pounds per square inch of boost, even plus 14 inches bursts. The theory was about to meet metal. The first run was cautious. The dynamometer hummed at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The smell of hot glycol filled the air. Hooker eased the throttle open until the boost gauge touched plus 6¼ lb, in squared, the official ceiling. Ricardo's assistant adjusted the spark advance. The stylus on the knock meter, the delicate instrument that recorded microsecond detonations, barely quivered. Then, with a brief nod, Hooker advanced the throttle. +8, +10, +12. The engine bellowed, a sound that seemed to double its pitch and fury without strain. The floor trembled underfoot. They watched the needles. Oil temperature steady. Cylinder heads hot but not critical. Exhaust gas temperature high but stable. Ricardo leaned in toward the gauge cluster, his thin lips curling upward. "No knock," he said quietly. Hooker's response was a grin. "Then physics can damn well keep up." By +14, the Merlin was producing nearly 1,300 brake horsepower, almost 300 more than the manual claimed was possible. A young technician standing by the coolant manifold stared at the numbers on the recording chart as if they were blasphemy. They were, in a way. The Air Ministry's official tables capped the Merlin III at 1,030 horsepower. Beyond that, they said, lay detonation, cracked heads, melted valves. Yet here it was, humming like a watch. The only true protest came from the dynamometer. Its belt drive groaned as the engine's torque climbed. Hooker throttled back, easing the boost to +10, then idle. The Merlin spun down, coughing into silence, the shed filled with the soft ticking of cooling metal. Harry Ricardo's notes from that afternoon survive in the Royal Aircraft Establishment archives. They are spare, almost cold in their phrasing. Merlin III, 100 octane. Boost +12. Sustained operation 5 minutes. No knock detected. Power output increased 25–30%. Observed stability excellent. But what those words meant was revolutionary. If replicated in flight, this engine would allow the Spitfire Mark I to reach 310 miles per hour at sea level, roughly 25–30 miles per hour faster than its published maximum. More importantly, it could climb 1,000 feet per minute faster, cutting the time to 20,000 feet from 9.5 minutes to just over 8. In aerial combat, that margin was everything climb meant life. The test team gathered around a black enamel kettle, drinking tea laced with evaporated milk and the thrill of discovery. Hooker drew figures in the condensation on a window pane. "Speed is proportional to power, 1/3, he murmured. "If we can hold +12 without knock, the Spitfire's drag curve gives us 30 miles an hour. 30 miles an hour is the difference between hunter and hunted." One man in the room disagreed not with the math, but with the politics. Air Commodore Henry Sorley, the Air Staff's liaison for fighter development, reminded them that the Air Ministry had standardized all combat fuel as 87 octane pool. The higher grade existed only in laboratory quantities, imported in secrecy from refineries in Texas and New Jersey. The Treasury balked at the cost. The Ministry of Supply feared dependence on foreign chemical processes. Hooker's reply was as unbureaucratic as it was prophetic. "Then we'd better depend quickly. The Germans already are." He was right. Intelligence from air attaché reports in Berlin had hinted that the Luftwaffe's DB-601A engines in the new Messerschmitt Bf 109E were running on C3 fuel, roughly 96 octane, allowing them to maintain higher power settings at altitude. Britain's answer, sitting on the test stand in that draughty shed, was a step ahead but still unsanctioned. When the figures reached Rolls-Royce's Derby offices, the reaction was cautious amazement. Ernest Hives, the company's managing director, wrote a terse memo to the Air Ministry. "It has been demonstrated that the Merlin III may safely operate at +12 per square inch when supplied with fuel of not less than 100 octane. This permits substantial gain in output and climb performance," he added, almost as an afterthought. "Supply of such fuel must be assured before operational recommendation." In bureaucratic language, that meant, if you can find the petrol, we can win the sky. Within weeks, Boscombe Down's test pilots repeated the experiment in the air. Their Spitfire, K9000, 795, climbed like a hawk. Flight reports logged speeds and climb rates the Air Ministry could not yet publish. Engine smooth, boost +12 attained, no sign of detonation. Acceleration remarkable, one entry reads. Pilots began whispering about a magic batch of fuel from the Americans. It was still forbidden, but its reputation was spreading faster than any order. The story might have ended there, a scientific curiosity filed under peacetime indulgence. But Europe was already sliding toward catastrophe. Within 5 months, Germany would invade Poland, and within a year, the Luftwaffe would be over the Channel. The data from that April afternoon at Farnborough would become a weapon. As Hooker walked out into the cold air that evening, he heard the last clinks of cooling metal behind him. He had, without realizing it, unlocked the door to a new kind of warfare, one fought not only with bullets and wings, but with chemistry. The Merlin's forbidden roar would echo through the next 6 years, its secret hidden in every boost gauge that crept beyond its red line. In the dimming light, Ricardo turned to him and said, half in jest, "You've just made the Spitfire faster than physics allows." Hooker smiled. "No," he said, "we've just changed the physics." May 1939, Ministry of Aircraft Production, London. The problem was no longer whether the 100-octane fuel worked. Hooker's data, Ricardo's combustion charts, and Boscombe Down's flight trials had made that beyond dispute. The problem was how to get enough of it to fight a war. Britain could not produce it. The country's refineries, still built on 1,930 seconds motoring chemistry, lacked the catalytic reformers and alkylation units needed to raise octane beyond 90. To the Air Ministry's supply officers, 100 octane might as well have been alchemy. Only the Americans Standard Oil of New Jersey, Shell Union, and the Sun Oil Company had perfected the process, and their refineries sat 3,000 miles away, across an Atlantic that might soon crawl with U-boats. In a cramped boardroom off Whitehall, Air Commodore Sorley laid the problem before the air staff. "Gentlemen," he said, tapping the folder marked Fuel, "high-grade confidential. We can build faster fighters, but only if we can feed them. The Spitfire can live at plus 12 boost. That means it can outclimb and outrun the Messerschmitt, but on 87 octane, it's a fair fight and we can't afford fair fights." Some officers scoffed. The Treasury's representative muttered about the fantastical expense of importing high-test petrol. Others warned that dependence on American fuel would give Washington leverage over British policy. Sorley cut through the protests with a single phrase. "Then the question, gentlemen, is whether we prefer debt or defeat." Behind the scenes, an unlikely alliance formed. Shell's Anglo-Dutch chemists, already experimenting with American refining patents, joined forces with Ricardo's fuel research station at Brooklands. Their aim was not just to import 100 octane, but to manufacture it. They began testing new cracking methods using isooctane blends and tetraethyl lead doping. By June, experimental batches from Shell's Stanlow refinery reached 95 to 96 octane close, but not yet enough for Hooker's superchargers. At Rolls-Royce Derby, the engineers prepared for the day the fuel arrived. They recalibrated carburetors, reinforced boost controllers, and revised coolant passages for sustained plus 12 operation. Each Merlin leaving the test stand now bore a small red triangle stenciled on the cowling 100 grade fuel only. It was a promise of future capability, not yet reality. Hooker spent his nights poring over airflow equations, calculating how long the bearings would survive at plus 14. He wrote to Ricardo in July, "We are living beyond our data. The physics say this engine shouldn't hold together at these pressures. But so far, the metal disagrees." Ricardo replied with characteristic precision, "Physics is not violated when better chemistry is applied." When war came that September, Britain's reserves of 100 octane barely filled a single tank farm less than 200,000 gallons. The rest would have to come by sea. American refineries in Baytown, Texas, and Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, began producing under a quiet agreement signed between Standard Oil and the British Purchasing Commission. Each tanker that left port was a lifeline disguised as commerce. By the spring of 1940, as the Battle of France erupted, convoys carrying high-test gasoline arrived at Avonmouth and Liverpool. Fighter Command began rationing it to select squadrons No. 19 at Duxford, No. 74 at Hornchurch, No. 111 at North Weald. Pilots received terse instructions. Fuel marked 100/130. Do not mix with Pool 87. Authorized for emergency use only. The phrase emergency use would soon define survival. On 13 May 1940, a young pilot officer of No. 19 Squadron, flying Spitfire N3200, took off over Dunkirk. His logbook noted simply, "First combat test of 100 octane fuel. Engine response immediate, acceleration extraordinary. The aircraft clawed into the sky faster than any Spitfire he had flown before. He shot down a Bf-109 and returned with his tank nearly dry. The ground crew siphoned the remaining amber liquid into a glass jar, labeling it like a relic. Word spread. Magic petrol, they called it in the mess halls. The Spitfire's reputation for miraculous climbs and blistering dives, its ability to stand on its tail and roar upwards, came directly from that forbidden experiment at Farnborough. By the time the Luftwaffe reached the Channel, every frontline Spitfire squadron was secretly fueled with the new brew. The RAF's public reports still spoke of standard fuel, but the truth was written in the sky. Messerschmitt pilots reported being outrun uphill, baffled by an enemy that seemed to defy its own specifications. The physics had changed, and with it, the course of the coming battle. By June 1940, the British expeditionary force had come home in tatters and oil. The beaches of Dunkirk still smelled of burnt petrol, but in the refineries of Avonmouth and Thames Haven, a different scent filled the air, sweet, sharp, metallic. It was 100-octane gasoline, arriving in gleaming tankers guarded by destroyers. The first shipments from America had survived the U-boats, and with them came the weapon that would make the Spitfire a miracle. In the months after the Farnborough tests, the RAF had quietly transformed. At first, only a few squadrons were chosen to receive the special fuel, NOS, 19, 54, and 74. Squadrons the elite few flying from Duxford, Hornchurch, and Gravesend. Their ground crews were instructed to handle the new petrol as if it were liquid gold. It came in drums painted crimson, stenciled with a discreet 100/130 marking and a warning. Highly leaded, do not mix with Pool 87. The airmen who refueled the fighters barely understood the chemistry, but they understood the results. Within days, pilots began whispering of magic fuel. Spitfire's Merlin III no longer coughed under high boost or detonated under sudden throttle. Instead, it roared. Climbs that once strained engines now felt effortless. Dives ended in acceleration instead of vibration. Flight Officer Geoffrey Wellham, then barely 18, wrote later in his log, "First time with new fuel, unbelievable climb. The engine pulls as if the aircraft has grown stronger overnight." It had. The improvement was measurable, almost obscene. At sea level, the Spitfire's top speed jumped from 282 miles per hour to 315 miles per hour, a gain of over 30 miles per hour. Its rate of climb soared by more than 500 feet per minute. Those were not incremental numbers. They were the difference between catching a bomber before it crossed Dover and watching it vanish inland. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Luftwaffe still ran on Germany's best fuel, C3 aviation gasoline, with an octane rating around 96. It was high quality, yes, but the DB601A engine in the Messerschmitt Bf 109E was tuned for altitude, not low-level acceleration. In a climb from the deck, the Spitfire now outperformed the German fighter for the first time. In the language of pilots, Britain had stolen back the vertical. At Hornchurch, Air Commodore Keith Park, soon to command No. 11 groups stood on the grass watching a section of Spitfires disappear into the clouds, their takeoff rolls shorter than ever before. "You can feel the difference in the ground shake," he said. The mechanics nodded. They could feel it in their bones. The change in performance was so startling that the Air Ministry ordered new tests at Boscombe Down. Engineers ran controlled flights comparing 87-octane and 100-octane performance on identical aircraft. The results, filed under Technical Memorandum 1521, confidential, confirmed what Hooker and Ricardo had already known. The higher octane fuel allowed sustained boosts of plus 12 pounds per square inch and short bursts at plus 14 without detonation or loss of power. The Merlin could safely deliver 1,310 horsepower, the same airframe that only months earlier had been rated at 1,030. A new term entered RAF vocabulary: war emergency power. Pilots were briefed that they could exceed normal boost for short periods when necessary to preserve life or achieve combat advantage. Every man in fighter command understood what that meant. A short period might be 30 seconds, the eternity between life and death in a turning fight. By mid-July, all operational Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons defending southern England had converted to 100-octane. It was done in secrecy. Even Winston Churchill's war speeches never mentioned it. To the public, Britain's new air confidence seemed like courage. To the enemy, it looked like miracle. In truth, it was chemistry. On the 10th of July, 1940, the Battle of Britain officially began. That morning, 70 German aircraft crossed the Channel. The RAF scrambled 200 fighters to intercept. Over Portland, Pilot Officer Al Deer's Spitfire of 54 Squadron fought 3 Messerschmitts at once. In his after-action report, he wrote, "Engaged 3 109 seconds, opened to plus 12 boost. Aircraft climbed better than enemy, pulled away in the turn, engine temperature steady. I believe the Germans are not aware we can do this. They soon would be. Luftwaffe intelligence analysts noticed the new performance patterns. Prisoners of war, captured after bailing out, insisted the RAF must be using boosted engines or foreign additives. One even claimed the British had fitted nitrous oxide systems. The truth that it was merely a new grade of petrol was too mundane to believe. Meanwhile, Britain's fuel logistics became a second battlefront. Each tanker voyage across the Atlantic was a calculated risk. On average, 1 in every 8 tankers never arrived. German U-boats targeted the precious Avgas convoys relentlessly. When the SS Athol Templar was sunk off Ireland in August, it carried enough 100 octane to fuel fighter command for 4 days. The loss was marked in quiet pencil strokes at Air Ministry headquarters. But the survivors kept coming. American refineries increased production month by month. By September 1940, over 40,000 tons per month of 100 octane flowed into British storage tanks, a logistical miracle hidden behind blackout curtains. The fuel's journey was heroic in itself, from crude oil in the Texas sun, through catalytic reformers in Louisiana, across submarine-infested seas, to a Spitfire climbing into the blue above Kent. Every gallon burned over the channel represented a chain of men, engineers, chemists, sailors who would never see the sky their work protected. That autumn, the Luftwaffe's losses mounted. German pilots began reporting that British fighters seemed to climb like rockets and turn inside impossibilities. The Bf-109E still held its edge at high altitude, but in the close-quarters combat that raged over southern England, speed off the deck meant survival. On September 15, the day later commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the truth of the Farnborough experiment came full circle. That morning, Spitfire Mk is from 610 Squadron intercepted a bomber formation south of London. Sergeant Pilot Ray Holmes rammed a Dornier to prevent it bombing Buckingham Palace. His engine running at +12 boost survived the impact long enough for him to bail out. When he landed, he found himself surrounded by cheering civilians who believed courage had saved them. He never knew that chemistry had, too. In the aftermath, Rolls-Royce engineers compiled combat reports and engine wear data. The results astounded them. Merlins operated for hundreds of hours under high boost without major failures. The forbidden experiment had become standard practice. By year's end, Hooker's quiet heresy had become Britain's unspoken weapon. The Spitfire's victory was not built only on wings and courage, it was distilled, refined, and shipped across oceans in drums marked 100 over 130. In the smoky halls of the Air Ministry, someone penciled a note in the margin of the monthly report: "Our greatest weapon may be invisible, volatile, and sold by the gallon." And so it was. The war of fire and octane had begun, and the Spitfire, once bound by physics, was free at last. Autumn 1940 settled over England with smoke and contrails. Every morning, the fields of Kent and Sussex echoed with the rumble of Merlins running at power settings no manual had ever approved. The pilots of fighter command boys, most of them had learned to trust their engines as much as their own reflexes. Those engines, in turn, trusted a chemistry that had barely existed a year before. To the pilots, the transformation seemed magical. To the scientists behind it, it was the most intricate industrial ballet of the war. The secret lay in a handful of substances that turned ordinary petrol into 100-octane aviation fuel chemical alchemy that rewrote the limits of combustion itself. The heart of the formula was iso-octane, a synthetic hydrocarbon whose molecular structure resisted detonation even under extreme compression. In 1939, the world produced only a few thousand gallons of it each month, laboratory quantities. By 1940, Shell and Standard Oil had found a way to synthesize it from isobutane and olefins through a new process called alkylation, developed only months earlier in America. Added to this base were controlled quantities of tetraethyl lead, a metallic anti-knock compound so toxic it required chemists to wear respirators while blending it. Even then, the formula wasn't simple. Each refinery batch had to balance volatility for cold starts, stability at altitude, and resistance to detonation under +12 boost. The blend included aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene for density, light fractions for vaporization, and ethylene dibromide to clean combustion chambers of lead deposits. In effect, it was engineered perfection, a fuel so tailored that a drop too many of one additive could cause disaster. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Harry Ricardo's team continued to refine the British variant. They tested different lead concentrations, running single-cylinder engines to the point of destruction. Out of hundreds of formulations, only a few achieved the delicate balance needed for combat. One of Ricardo's assistants described the process as alchemy with the smell of death. The fumes of leaded petrol were constant. 2 technicians were hospitalized with poisoning before proper ventilation was installed. Yet every successful batch meant more power in the air. By the winter of 1940-41, the Ministry of Aircraft Production and Shellmex and BP had converted entire refining systems to the new high-octane process. The Stanlow refinery near Liverpool became the nerve centre of Britain's domestic 100-octane production. Pipelines, camouflaged and guarded, carried the fuel south to dispersal depots at Avonmouth, Forley, and the secret underground storage tanks at RAF Burtonwood. Each gallon was logged, tested, and rationed. Hooker and Ricardo met again that November in the same draughty test bay at Farnborough where it had begun. This time, the experiment was official. They ran a Merlin III, the new version fitted to the Spitfire Mark II, and pushed the throttle far beyond its red line, +14, +16, +18 pounds per square inch. The engine roared with the fury of an unleashed predator, the propeller slipstream shaking the roof panels. When they shut it down, the readings stunned them: 1,475 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Hooker ran his hand along the warm cowling, almost in disbelief. "We've doubled her power in 2 years," he murmured. Ricardo nodded. "And without changing a single cylinder bore." "That's the chemistry talking." Their findings spread through the engineering branches of the RAF like gospel. By the time the Spitfire McV appeared in 1941, the engine, now the Merlin 45, was designed entirely around 100-octane fuel. Every calculation, from supercharger gear ratios to propeller pitch, assumed high boost as normal operation. It was the first fighter designed for the new chemistry rather than constrained by the old. The change rippled far beyond Britain. When America entered the war in December 1941, the US Army Air Forces had already adopted British fuel standards. The P-38, P-47, and P-51 would all be born into the same high-octane lineage. What had started as a forbidden experiment in a backroom shed had become the cornerstone of Allied air power. Meanwhile, the Germans lagged behind. Their synthetic fuel industry, based on the Fischer-Tropsch process, produced only small quantities of 100-octane equivalent fuel. Most Luftwaffe aircraft ran on 87-95 octane, limiting their boost pressures to around +1.3 atmospheres. To compensate, engineers pushed their engines to mechanical extremes, tighter tolerances, higher supercharger ratios, complex fuel injection. But nothing could substitute for octane. Their engines ran hotter, failed sooner, and detonated under stress. Captured German reports, later analyzed by the Allied Oil Intelligence Center, revealed their growing frustration. A 1942 memorandum from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM, complained, "The British Spitfire exhibits exceptional acceleration and climb. This cannot be explained by propeller or aerodynamic design alone. The cause appears to be superior fuel of unknown composition." The unknown composition, of course, was already filling British and American skies by the million gallons. But even miracles had limits. As 1941 turned to 1942, Rolls-Royce and Ricardo began experimenting with 150-octane fuel, a volatile blend enriched with benzene and more tetraethyl lead. intended to support boost pressures of +18 to +20. The results bordered on lunacy, short bursts producing over 1,700 horsepower, enough to bend propeller blades and strip supercharger clutches. Pilots testing the new fuel reported uncontrollable acceleration and violent torque. One Spitfire at Boscombe Down tore its reduction gear apart mid-climb. The engineers learned to respect the threshold between chemistry and catastrophe. Still, progress continued. Each improvement in fuel allowed more daring in combat. With higher boost came faster climbs, tighter turns, and more decisive engagements. The pilots may not have known the equations, but they knew the results. When the throttle went forward, the Merlin's growl deepened into a sound that could break the enemy's will. In late 1942, as Hooker prepared to join the turbocharger division working on the new Griffon engine, he visited Ricardo one last time. The war had shifted, the Blitz was over, but the battle for the skies over France had begun. They stood once again before a test stand, watching a Merlin run at 1,500 horsepower with quiet composure. Hooker looked at the gauges, then at Ricardo. "It's strange," he said. "All this from a bit of fuel we weren't supposed to use." Ricardo smiled faintly. "History is written by those who ignore the red lines." Outside, the test cell door opened, and the smell of burned petrol drifted into the cold evening air. That scent, the ghost of iso-octane and lead, was the perfume of survival. The chemistry of victory wasn't written in glory or slogans. It was distilled, refined, measured, and tested behind closed doors. It lived in the unseen equations on Hooker's chalkboard, the sleepless calculations of refinery chemists, the steady hands of ground crewmen fueling fighters before dawn. And every time a Spitfire roared into the sky, climbing higher than physics had once allowed, it carried with it the invisible legacy of those who had dared to light the forbidden fire. By 1943, the red line on the boost gauge was no longer a warning, it was an invitation. Every Spitfire cockpit bore that familiar white arc and red mark at +6¼ pounds per square inch, the supposed upper limit of safe operation. Yet every pilot in fighter command knew, without saying, that the war was being won well above it. The once forbidden +12 boost had become standard. It was written now in engineering bulletins, in the training syllabi at Cranwell and Aston Down, and in the informal traditions of every squadron from Biggin Hill to Tangmere. When in doubt, shove it through the gate. The phrase referred to the physical gate in the throttle quadrant, a small metal latch that prevented accidental overboost. Push past it, and the Merlin transformed. A smooth hum became a feral snarl, a sound that sent a shiver through the airframe and through the pilot's bones. For the men who flew daily over occupied France, that noise was both reassurance and defiance. The first half of 1943 was a proving ground for this new era of power. The Luftwaffe, still formidable, was now fighting a different Spitfire, the Mark I, fitted with the two-stage supercharged Merlin 61, a direct descendant of Hooker's wartime experiments. Designed around 100 octane from the start, the 61 could safely run at +15 boost on emergency power, producing nearly 1,720 horsepower at altitude. The Spitfire Mark IX was born not out of calm design but desperation. Early in 1942, reports arrived that the Germans had fielded a new fighter, the Focke-Wulf FW-190A, faster, better armed, and nearly unbeatable below 20,000 feet. Early Spitfires were being torn apart in dogfights. Panic rippled through fighter command. It was Hooker, now in charge of Rolls-Royce's supercharger division, who found the solution. He proposed grafting the new two-stage Merlin onto the existing Merc-Vif airframe, creating a hybrid fighter that could match the Focke-Wulf's acceleration and surpass its climb. The prototype, flown at Boscombe Down in the spring of 1942, astonished everyone. At +15 boost with 100 octane fuel, it reached 408 miles per hour at 28,000 feet faster than any Spitfire before it, and fast enough to turn the tables on the Luftwaffe once more. The chemistry that had begun in secret at Farnborough now drove every decision in British aircraft design. The Ministry of Aircraft Production issued new specifications to Rolls-Royce, de Havilland, and Napier, engines to be designed for continuous operation at high boost on 100-octane fuel. The red line that had once marked danger was now the baseline of progress. At Duxford, a new generation of pilots learned the ritual of the overboost climb. Squadron leader Johnny Johnson, who would become the RAF's highest-scoring Spitfire ace, described it best. You opened the throttle, felt the gate yield beneath your hand, and the aircraft surged like it had been kicked by God himself. The enemy was below you before they knew you'd begun. For German pilots, the shift was bewildering. The 4W-190's brief reign as king of the Channel front evaporated in months. Luftwaffe combat reports from mid-1943 describe Spitfires of new type with astonishing acceleration and climb. Some claimed they must be powered by engines twice the size of the Merlin. Others assumed the British had adopted methanol injection, a technique then in experimental use on German engines. The truth that the advantage lay in the chemistry of their fuel and the refinement of their superchargers remained invisible. Behind the front lines, the work continued in laboratories and refineries. Ricardo's team at the fuel research station had shifted from proving octane ratings to ensuring consistency. As Britain's refineries expanded, variations in additive composition threatened engine reliability. Minor impurities in tetraethyl lead, for instance, could cause spark plug fouling, and even trace amounts of water in storage drums degraded the precise detonation characteristics. In one case, a contaminated shipment from a hastily constructed refinery in Wales led to 23 Spitfires suffering misfires mid-combat. The pilots blamed the mechanics blamed the fuel drums. Ricardo's post-incident report traced it to microscopic corrosion in the storage tanks, a chemical chain reaction that reduced the anti-knock effectiveness by less than 1%, yet enough to make a difference in battle. His recommendation? Glass-lined storage vessels for all leaded fuel. Within a month, the ministry complied. Every fraction of reliability mattered. The growing symbiosis between engineering and chemistry became the unseen backbone of the air war. Rolls-Royce's Merlin variants multiplied 45, 61, 66, 70, 76, each tailored to a particular altitude or mission profile. The differences often came down to fuel and boost. In 1939, maximum permissible boost had been a phrase of caution. By 1943, it was an evolving doctrine of exploitation. And still, Hooker and his contemporaries pushed harder. At the experimental facilities in Hucknall, they began testing the Merlin 130 series with even higher compression and a new fuel rated at 150 octane, a monstrous concoction of iso-octane toluene, benzene, and 6.5 milliliters of tetraethyl lead per gallon. Under these conditions, the Merlin 130 produced over 2,000 horsepower in short bursts. The sound was terrifying, an animal growl that made the ground tremble. The first time a test pilot opened the throttle fully, the engine mountings tore loose from the frame. Hooker's report to the ministry was blunt. We are approaching the practical limits of piston power. Above these pressures, the engines may perform, but they do not forgive. Yet the work was essential. The Americans had already taken the idea further, designing the massive Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp around high-octane fuel from its inception. Their P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug, was an airborne brute that turned the chemistry of octane into physical dominance. It was not elegant like the Spitfire, but it carried the same secret in its tanks, the ability to use fuel that allowed pressures and temperatures no one else dared to reach. By the late summer of 1943, the collaboration between Allied fuel scientists had formalized. British and American chemists exchanged data under the Anglo-American Petroleum Agreement, synchronizing specifications so that every Allied fighter from Spitfire to Mustang to Thunderbolt could run seamlessly on shared stocks of 100/130 fuel. It was one of the quietest but most consequential acts of the war. Standardization of power, In a lecture to engineering officers that autumn, Harry Ricardo said, "Every mile per hour we've gained has been bought not by new metal, but by new molecules." He was right. When Allied bombers later roared across Europe escorted by high-powered fighters, their success was born of that molecular revolution. Chemistry had become strategy. By Christmas 1943, the red line on the boost gauge remained in every cockpit, but it was symbolic now, a relic of a vanished caution. Pilots still glanced at it, perhaps out of superstition, before pushing past it into the zone where physics blurred into willpower. They flew there daily, trusting in the invisible miracle that burned within their engines. The forbidden experiment had become routine. The impossible had become standard procedure. And the Spitfire, the aircraft that once flew on borrowed fuel and borrowed time, now roared through the clouds on a tide of science so advanced that even the men who created it could scarcely believe what they'd done. The red line had not vanished. It had simply moved upward, ever upward, until it disappeared into the sound of victory. By early 1944, the war in the air had become a war of logistics disguised as heroism. Behind every Spitfire sortie, every bomber stream to the Ruhr, and every P-47 dive over Normandy lay a network of pipes, refineries, and laboratories working with the precision of a machine that could never be allowed to stop. The miracle fuel that began in a small Farnborough shed now flowed in rivers millions of gallons of 100 octane, refined, blended, and guarded as jealously as atomic secrets. In Whitehall, the Ministry of Fuel and Power called it Project Mercury. Few outside its corridors knew the code name, and fewer still understood its scope. Project Mercury's mandate was simple: secure, transport, and protect the high-octane lifeblood of Allied air power at any cost. Its operations stretched from Texas to Tunis, from the refineries of Baton Rouge to the forward dispersal drums stacked along hedgerows in Normandy. The stakes were no longer academic. The entire Allied air strategy, Operation Point-Blank's destruction of German industry, the D-Day air cover, the long-range bomber escorts depended on one assumption: that every aircraft could run at its designed boost rating. If the fuel failed, everything failed. By January, the first signs of strain appeared. Tanker losses in the North Atlantic had risen sharply. German Type 9 submarines prowled the shipping lanes, hunting the silver convoys that carried high-test fuel. In response, the Admiralty began assigning destroyer escorts specifically to Afghans convoys. These ships carried not food or weapons, but the ability for Spitfires to climb. Meanwhile, in the desert and jungles, the chemistry itself was being pushed to its limits. Under tropical heat, the delicate balance of leaded additives began to falter. British maintenance units in India reported cases of phase separation, the lighter fractions of the fuel evaporating during storage, leaving the heavier components behind. Engines running on this stale fuel detonated violently under boost. Ricardo's team at the Fuel Research Station had anticipated the problem. They shipped packets of chemical stabilizers by air to be stirred by hand into each batch before use. Pilots never knew their safety depended on a teaspoon of reagent. The Germans knew something was happening but could not match it. Synthetic refineries at Leuna and Politz worked day and night to produce their 96-octane C3 fuel, but they were already stretched. Allied bombers targeted them relentlessly, guided by reports from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey predicting that destruction of Germany's high-octane capacity would ground the Luftwaffe within months. The prediction proved correct. By mid-1944, German aviation fuel output had fallen by 80%, and what remained often degraded below 90 octane. Pilots were ordered to reduce takeoff boost to preserve engines. Their aircraft grew slower, less responsive, weaker. While the Luftwaffe's chemistry declined, the Allies evolved. In the early months of 1944, a new blend appeared 100 over 150 grade, developed jointly by British and American chemists. It used massive quantities of toluene and benzene, both highly volatile aromatics sourced from synthetic rubber production. The fuel could support plus £25 per square inch boost in the latest Merlin 66 engines and nearly 2,000 horsepower in the new Griffon series. The catch was that it was unstable and dangerous. Mechanics called it blue fire for the faint glow it gave off in the dark. The first squadrons to use it were the 2nd Tactical Air Force Spitfire IX preparing for D-Day. Official orders listed the new fuel as 100/130, a bureaucratic deception to mask its true composition. Pilots were instructed not to exceed plus 18 boost except in cases of utmost emergency. Few obeyed. Over France that summer, the Spitfires and Tempests screamed through the sky at power settings once considered suicidal. The forbidden had become doctrine. Hooker, now overseeing supercharger production at Rolls-Royce, visited one of the forward bases in June. He watched a line of Spitfire 9s warming up before dawn, their exhausts strobing blue against the dark hedgerows. When the first aircraft roared into the air, he smiled faintly. "Every one of them is flying on mathematics and lead," he said to a young officer beside him. The man didn't understand, but nodded, anyway. That same week, a Luftwaffe technical officer named Major Wolfgang Spater wrote a bitter memorandum to Berlin. "Our engines are mechanically sound but cannot equal the British for power. They climb away from us with no visible modification. There must be a secret fuel. No other explanation fits the observed performance." He was right. Allied superiority in 1944 was chemical, not mystical. The expansion of 100-octane production had become one of the largest industrial efforts in history. American refineries at Baton Rouge, Houston, and Baytown ran non-stop, producing over 4 billion gallons per year. In Britain, Stanlow, Fawley, and Grangemouth were linked by underground pipelines feeding the airfields. Each RAF tanker carried the emblem of the Petroleum Warfare Department, an organization so secret it appeared nowhere in wartime news. Its motto, discreetly stamped on a few crates, read, "Combustion wins wars." The men at the sharp end saw the effects daily. Over Normandy, pilots reported astonishing acceleration. In one debriefing from July 1944, squadron leader James "Johnny" Johnson described a dogfight with a Messerschmitt 109G. Opened to plus 25 for brief burst. The enemy aircraft broke away sharply, but the Spitfire continued to gain, closed from astern and fired. Enemy disintegrated. The engineering staff at Rolls-Royce kept careful logs of such encounters, matching pilot testimony to performance graphs. Every victory was another data point, proving the science right. Still, the risks were immense. The 100/150 fuel attacked rubber seals and corroded carburetor fittings. Several aircraft caught fire during takeoff when vapors ignited. Mechanics developed new rituals, wiping filler caps with alcohol, grounding refueling hoses, praying silently. "You could smell death in that stuff," one recalled. "But it made our boys gods in the air." As summer turned to autumn, the chemists who had started it all watched their creation shape history. Ricardo, aging but still sharp, visited the Air Ministry for what would be his final wartime consultation. He arrived in his trademark tweed, carrying a briefcase stuffed with test results. When asked to summarize the impact of high-octane fuel on the war effort, he replied simply, "Gentlemen, it is not hyperbole to say that octane saved civilization." By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing, its pilots grounded by empty tanks and shattered refineries. Meanwhile, Allied aircraft ranged freely from Berlin to the Ardennes. The war of chemistry had been won. In a final irony, the Germans' own scientists captured after the war confirmed what the Allies had long known. At the 1945 U.S. Japanese Aviation Symposium, one former Luftwaffe engineer told his captors, "We thought you had some secret injection device. We never believed it was just better fuel." But it was. The quiet collaboration between a handful of British engineers and chemists, Hooker, Ricardo, Sorley, and their nameless refinery counterparts, had changed the physics of flight and the fate of nations. The Spitfire's roar over Normandy, the P-47's thunder over the Rhine, the Mustang's long-range escort to Berlin, all were songs written in octane. The forbidden experiment had grown into an empire of combustion. The line between science and salvation had blurred in a cloud of exhaust over Europe. And though the world would one day forget the smell of 100 octane, every victory that followed carried its ghost in the air. The war was ending, but the work had not. In the spring of 1945, when the Luftwaffe was broken and the Allied air forces ranged freely across the continent, a quiet convoy rolled through the ruined towns of northern France toward a small village called Boscombe Forward Field. Inside one of the trucks, covered in canvas, was the final expression of an idea that had begun 6 years earlier in a draughty shed at Farnborough, the last experimental Merlin, test-rated for +30 boost on the most volatile fuel ever made. The war's outcome was no longer in question, but the engineers wanted to know how far could it go. Dr. Stanley Hooker, now officially chief engineer of supercharger development, stood with his slide rule and notebooks while a team of airmen bolted the new engine into a stripped-down Spitfire 14. It was fitted with a Griffon 65, larger, heavier, and even more temperamental than the Merlin, but this prototype had been reinforced and instrumented to measure every second of its run. The ground crew nicknamed it the Widowmaker. At dawn, they ran it. The gauges climbed. +12, +18, +24. The roar deepened into a sonic pressure wave that made nearby birds scatter. Hooker watched the data scroll on the recorder drums, his pencil trembling. At +30 boost, the Griffon produced 2,340 horsepower, the propeller tips nearly supersonic. The aircraft strained against its chocks like a living thing. The engineers cut power after 90 seconds, the exhausts glowing dull orange. When they shut it down, no one spoke. They all knew they had reached the physical limit of piston flight. Beyond that would come supercharged madness, and after that, jets. Later that morning, Hooker wrote in his logbook, "The piston engine has fulfilled its purpose. The future belongs to the turbine, but without this knowledge, no turbine would exist." It was true. The same mathematics that had taught the Merlin to breathe at impossible pressures would form the basis of the jet era. Hooker himself would move to work with Frank Whittle on the Rolls-Royce Welland and later the Derwent, applying lessons first learned with the forbidden 100-octane fuel. The smooth thrust of the jet was born from the violent detonation of its ancestor. In those final months, the men who had bent physics to their will scattered across the post-war world. Harry Ricardo returned to civilian research, studying diesel efficiency but always carrying the quiet pride of a man who had changed the war with chemistry. He never patented his wartime work, insisting it belonged to the nation, not the man. He died in 1974, his notebooks still smelling faintly of leaded fuel. Air Commodore Sorley, who had once fought to arm the Spitfire with 8 guns, now oversaw the transition to jet interceptors. He would often say to young officers, "Remember what the Spitfire taught us. Speed is useless without supply, and courage is nothing without combustion." And Hooker brilliant, restless Hooker remained the bridge between ages. In 1947, when Rolls-Royce tested its first production jet, the Nene, its chief engineer, found a note in the engine room, unsigned, but in Hooker's handwriting. "Start cautiously. Remember Farnborough. The numbers lie until the flame tells the truth." That line became an unofficial motto for British engineers. In Germany, meanwhile, the captured scientists who had dismissed the Spitfire as chemically advantaged pored over Allied fuel reports in disbelief. They discovered that Britain's impossible octane ratings had been achieved not by deception, but by the industrial might of free collaboration. Shell, Standard Oil, the RAE, Ricardo's lab, and hundreds of unnamed chemists. The regime that had believed only in conquest had been defeated by cooperation. By 1946, the war's mechanical relics were being scrapped, but the story of their creation spread quietly among the engineers who built the next generation. The lessons of the forbidden experiment became engineering doctrine: control the pressure, master detonation, standardize perfection. Years later, when Hooker was asked what he remembered most about that April night in 1939 when they first ran the forbidden 100-octane test, he smiled. "It wasn't the sound," he said. "It was the disbelief. The machine told us something that no book would allow, that the limits we obeyed were only the limits we feared to test." The Spitfire had been a weapon, yes, but also an experiment that changed the meaning of possibility. Its beauty lay not just in its shape or its battles, but in the invisible equations behind its power. The war ended, but the flame it lit in the minds of those who built it burned on through every turbine, every jet, every machine that ever dared to go faster than the rules said it could. And somewhere, perhaps, the echo of that Merlin still rolls through the clouds, its song the sound of humanity's refusal to accept the boundaries of the known world. By 1949, the smell of high-octane fuel had faded from the airfields of southern England. The Spitfires that once screamed off grass runways at dawn now sat in neat rows awaiting the cutter's torch. Their aluminum skins, once warm with the vibration of power, reflected only quiet skies. Yet for the men who had built and flown them, the work was not over. The world was changing again, and the lessons born from that forbidden experiment at Farnborough were being rewritten into the blueprints of the jet age. Dr. Stanley Hooker, who had once coaxed impossible pressure ratios from the Merlin's supercharger, now stood before a new kind of machine at Rolls-Royce's Derby works. The Avon jet engine, a cylinder of precision steel with no pistons, no cylinders, no carburetor, only air, heat, and velocity. The irony was not lost on him. The Merlin had conquered physics through compression. The Avon would conquer it through simplicity. Yet at the heart of both lay the same truth: control the burn, and you control the future. In his design notes for the Avon, Hooker wrote, "All that we learned from octane now applies to temperature. The same laws of detonation, of stoichiometry, of flame propagation, they have simply moved into another chamber." Every pressure curve traced at Farnborough, every minute of knock testing in Ricardo's labs, had paved the way for this. Jet fuel, too, owed its lineage to that wartime. Chemistry. Kerosene had replaced gasoline, but the obsession with purity, stability, and energy density remained. Engineers who once calculated octane numbers now spoke of calorific values and flashpoints. The vocabulary had changed, but the religion of combustion endured. The Air Ministry, reorganized into the Ministry of Supply, funded this new age with the same urgency once reserved for Spitfire squadrons. Britain's first jet fighters, the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire, entered service before the war ended, but it was in the post-war years that their engines matured. Hooker's refinements to Whittle's original centrifugal designs produced smooth, reliable power that could propel aircraft past the speed of sound. Each milestone, the first level Mach 1 flight, the first jet airliner, owed an invisible debt to those Merlin test runs on 100 octane. Harry Ricardo, though in his 70s, remained an elder statesman of combustion. His post-war lectures at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers drew crowds of students eager to hear the man who had taught fire to obey. In one 1950 address, he recalled the night the Merlin first ran beyond its rated boost. "When we broke the limit, we discovered not danger, but understanding. That is what science truly is, a dialogue with risk." Ricardo's wartime notebooks became the foundation of modern combustion theory. The equations that described detonation thresholds in 1939 would decades later define fuel injection parameters for turbines and rockets. Even NASA engineers, when calculating the thermal profiles of the Saturn V's engines, would cite his constants. The line from that shed in Farnborough ran all the way to the moon. Air Commodore Sorley, retired but still influential, wrote a memorandum to the RAF in 1951 titled "Lessons of the Propeller Age." It was not widely circulated, but among those who read it, one paragraph stood out. "We learned that technology without logistics is safer, vanity, and courage without fuel is suicide." The The Spitfire was not only an aircraft, it was a symbol of what coordination between chemist, engineer, and pilot can achieve when necessity makes them one. The sentiment resonated beyond aviation. In the universities and refineries, young scientists treated the wartime breakthroughs as sacred text. The study of combustion became not just engineering but heritage, a kind of national alchemy. Britain had survived because it learned to distill power from scarcity, to turn molecules into margin. And yet, as the jet age roared forward, the men who had once risked their careers on a forbidden experiment slipped quietly into history. Hooker would go on to design the Conway, the world's first bypass turbofan, and later the Pegasus engine that powered the vertical takeoff Harrier. Each new design carried a whisper of that earlier defiance, the refusal to accept the limits of the chart. When asked late in life what he considered his greatest achievement, Hooker paused, then said, "Keeping the engine running when everyone else said, 'Shut it down.'" He was speaking of 1939. But the words might have served as an epitaph for his generation. The Spitfire's roar faded, replaced by the dry thunder of jet turbines. But in that sound, the shriek of compressed air meeting fire, lived the echo of everything those men had learned. That progress is born not of obedience, but of the courage to overboost the world and trust it will hold together. The war had ended, but the experiment had not. It had merely changed its fuel,